Welcome to this deep analysis of one of the darkest and most disturbing stories in American history. Tell us where you're watching from. I ask that you subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing stories in this format. Well, here it is. The morning light filters through the tall windows of the Heritage Art Conservation Center in Springfield, Missouri, casting long rectangular shadows across the restoration studio. Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusts her magnifying glasses and leans closer to the massive oil painting that arrived 3 days ago from a private estate sale in the Ozark region. The canvas measures 6 feet by 4 feet, depicting what appears to be a prosperous farm from the mid-19th century. The painting shows a grand white house with Greek Revival columns, expansive tobacco fields stretching toward rolling hills, and in the foreground, a well-dressed family positioned on the veranda. The father stands tall with his hand on an ornate chair, the mother sits regally with a closed Bible, and 3 children arrange themselves according to apparent age and importance. Behind them, barely visible in the composition's darker edges, stands a young black boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, holding a silver tray. Sarah has been working in art restoration for 15 years, and something about this painting immediately captured her attention beyond its obvious historical value. The technique is masterful, the brushwork deliberate, and the attention to detail extraordinary. Yet there is something unsettling in the composition, something her trained eye cannot quite identify but feels instinctively. Her colleague, Marcus Chen, enters the studio carrying 2 cups of coffee and approaches the workspace where Sarah has set up her examination area. Marcus specializes in historical pigment analysis and has worked alongside Sarah on dozens of restoration projects, developing an almost telepathic understanding of each other's observations and concerns. The painting came with minimal provenance information. The estate attorney who handled the sale mentioned it had been discovered in the attic of the Thornhill estate, a property that had remained in the same family for over 170 years before the last descendant died without heirs. The attorney provided a brief note indicating the painting was commissioned in 1854 by Jeremiah Thornhill, a prominent landowner in Taney County, Missouri, though no artist's signature could be initially identified. The current owner, a history museum in Branson, purchased the piece specifically because it represents one of the few surviving visual records of antebellum life in the Ozark region, an area often overlooked in discussions of Southern plantation culture and slavery. Sarah begins her preliminary examination by photographing the painting under various lighting conditions. Standard visible light reveals the obvious composition, but when she switches to raking light, angling the illumination at a steep angle across the canvas surface, subtle imperfections emerge. There are areas where the paint sits differently, suggesting possible overpainting or alterations made after the original completion. She notices these irregularities particularly around the figure of the enslaved boy, whose position in the painting seems almost deliberately marginalized, pushed to the very edge of the composition where shadows dominate. Under ultraviolet light, certain areas fluoresce differently, indicating that some sections may have been touched up or modified using different materials than the original painting. Marcus sets up the infrared reflectography equipment, a technology that allows them to see beneath the surface layers of paint by detecting the carbon-based underdrawing that artists typically create before applying color. As the infrared images slowly process on the computer screen, both conservators lean forward with increasing interest. The underdrawing reveals that the original composition was significantly different from what currently appears on the surface. In the preliminary sketch, the enslaved boy was positioned much more prominently, standing directly beside the ornate chair where the patriarch now places his hand. More intriguingly, the infrared reveals that the boy's hands, now painted holding a silver tray, were originally drawn in a completely different position, reaching toward or possibly holding something near the base of the chair. The discovery sends a surge of adrenaline through Sarah's professional curiosity. Alterations in historical paintings are not uncommon, but the deliberate repositioning of a human figure, especially an enslaved person, raises questions about historical narrative and who controlled the visual record of the past. She documents everything meticulously, knowing that each observation might prove significant. The infrared images also reveal what appears to be text or symbols beneath the current paint layers, though the resolution is not clear enough to decipher the content. Sarah makes a note to conduct X-radiography, which will penetrate even deeper into the painting structure and reveal the densest materials, including any metallic elements that might be hidden within the composition. Over the next several hours, Sarah and Marcus conduct a comprehensive technical analysis. They take microsamples from different areas of the painting for pigment analysis, carefully extracting tiny fragments no larger than a grain of sand from edges and cracks where the removal will not be visible. Under microscopic examination, these samples reveal the paint's stratigraphy, the layers of material applied over time. The analysis confirms that the painting underwent significant alterations approximately 10 to 15 years after its initial creation, based on the chemical composition of the pigments used in the overpainting. The original paint contains hand-ground natural pigments typical of the 1850s, while the alterations use commercially manufactured pigments that became available in the late 1860s and early 1870s. Sarah's mind races with possibilities. Why would someone alter this painting years after its creation? What was the boy originally holding or reaching for that seemed important enough to paint over? She examines the family in the portrait more closely, studying their faces and postures. The father, Jeremiah Thornhill, stares directly at the viewer with an expression of stern confidence, his hand resting possessively on the chair. The chair itself is remarkable, an expensive piece of furniture with carved details and what appears to be inlaid decorations on its legs and back. The mother's face shows practiced composure, though there is something in her eyes, a tension that Sarah cannot quite articulate. The children display the stiff formality expected in formal portraits of the era, though the youngest, a girl of perhaps 5 years old, seems to look not at the viewer but slightly to the side, toward where the enslaved boy now stands in shadow. As evening approaches and the natural light fades, Sarah decides to conduct one more examination before ending the day's work. She positions the painting under high-intensity magnification and begins a systematic inch-by-inch examination of the entire surface, looking for any detail she might have missed. When she reaches the lower right quadrant, where the ornate chair's legs meet the painted floor, she notices something that makes her breath catch. There, barely visible in the deep shadows behind the chair's rear leg, is a tiny irregularity in the paint surface. Under magnification, it appears to be a deliberately created texture, almost like a fingerprint pressed into wet paint, or perhaps the impression of something that was once there and was later covered. Marcus joins her at the magnification station, and together they study the anomaly. The texture suggests that something three-dimensional was indeed part of the original painting, either attached to the surface or painted in such heavy impasto that it created significant relief. Around this textured area, the overpainting is particularly thick, as though the person making the alterations was determined to completely obscure whatever had been there. Sarah makes the decision that tomorrow they will begin the delicate process of testing whether this overpainting can be safely removed. The museum has given them full authorization to conduct a complete restoration, which includes removing any non-original alterations if it can be done without damaging the underlying original work. That night, Sarah returns to her apartment in downtown Springfield but finds herself unable to stop thinking about the painting. She opens her laptop and begins researching the Thornhill family and their Ozark estate. Historical records are sparse for this region during the antebellum period, as the Ozarks were somewhat isolated from the major plantation economies of the deeper South. However, she discovers that Jeremiah Thornhill was indeed a significant landowner who operated a large-scale tobacco farm using enslaved labor. Census records from 1850 indicate he owned 23 enslaved people, though their names are not recorded, as was typical for the dehumanizing record-keeping of the era. Property records show the Thornhill farm encompassed over 2,000 acres of prime agricultural land along the White River. Sarah finds a brief mention of the Thornhill family in a book about Ozark history published in 1932. The passage notes that the family was prominent in local affairs before the Civil War but experienced significant hardship during and after the conflict. The book mentions that Jeremiah Thornhill died in 1871 under circumstances described only as tragic, and his widow sold much of the property shortly thereafter. The family never regained their antebellum prominence, though descendants continued to live on a much-reduced portion of the original estate until the property was finally sold in the early 2000s. The book provides no information about the enslaved people who lived and worked on the Thornhill farm, their stories lost to the silence that so often surrounds those who were denied the power to record their own histories. As Sarah prepares for bed, she finds herself thinking about the boy in the painting. His face, even in the shadowy background where he was relegated, shows remarkable detail. The unknown artist clearly had skill and had chosen to render this child with care and attention, capturing something in his expression that transcends the dehumanizing role he was forced to play in the composition. There is intelligence in his eyes, and something else, something Sarah might describe as determination or perhaps defiance, though so subtle it could easily be overlooked. She wonders who he was, what his name was, what became of him. She wonders what he was holding or reaching for before someone decided that detail needed to be erased from history. The next morning arrives with heavy clouds and the promise of rain, typical weather for Springfield in late October. Sarah arrives at the conservation center an hour earlier than usual, eager to begin the delicate work of removing the overpainting from the section behind the chair. Marcus is already there, having apparently shared her eagerness, and has prepared the workspace with all the necessary materials. The removal of overpainting is one of the most delicate aspects of art restoration, requiring patience, precision, and a thorough understanding of the chemical properties of different paint layers. They will use a combination of gentle solvents applied with tiny cotton swabs, working microscopically slowly to dissolve the later paint without affecting the original layer beneath. Before beginning the actual removal, Sarah conducts additional tests on inconspicuous areas of the overpainting to determine the most effective solvent mixture. Different pigments and binding media respond differently to various chemicals, and what works in one area might be disastrous in another. After several hours of testing, she settles on a carefully calibrated mixture that successfully softens the later paint while leaving the original work intact. She and Marcus position the painting on a specially designed easel that allows them to work at the optimal angle, with high-intensity adjustable lighting and magnification equipment trained on the area behind the chair. The work proceeds with excruciating slowness. Sarah applies the solvent mixture with cotton swabs no larger than a matchstick head, allowing each application to work for precisely timed intervals before gently rolling away the softened paint. The overpainting is thick and was applied with determination, suggesting that whoever made these alterations wanted to ensure that what lay beneath would never be rediscovered. As hours pass, Sarah and Marcus take turns at the magnification station, their eyes needing frequent breaks from the intense concentration. The conservation center's other staff members stop by periodically, drawn by curiosity about the project, but Sarah politely discourages spectators, needing complete focus for this painstaking work to be mid-afternoon. After nearly 6 hours of continuous work, the first significant revelation emerges. Beneath the overpainting, the original surface begins to appear, and it is immediately clear that something extraordinary was hidden. The texture that Sarah noticed yesterday is not simply an artifact of the painting technique but represents something that was originally part of the composition. As more of the overpainting dissolves away, a shape begins to emerge, rendered in careful detail by the original artist. It appears to be a small book, painted in such realistic detail that the tooled leather binding and gold lettering on the spine are clearly visible even after 170 years. The book is positioned at the base of the chair, partially concealed by the shadow but clearly accessible to someone standing where the enslaved boy was originally depicted. The discovery sends ripples of excitement through the conservation team. Marcus immediately begins photographing every stage of the revelation while Sarah continues the meticulous removal process. As more of the book becomes visible, they can see that the artist painted it with remarkable attention to detail, including what appears to be a bookmark or ribbon extending from between the pages. The positioning is deliberate, the book placed in such a way that it appears to have been set down quickly or perhaps hidden in haste. Sarah notices that the boy's feet, in the restored original composition, are positioned as though he is standing very close to where this book lies, and his gaze, when one studies the painting carefully, seems to be directed downward and to the side, exactly where the book would be visible to him. As the afternoon progresses into evening, Sarah makes another crucial discovery. Beneath the overpainting that obscured the boy's hands, the original painting shows his right hand extended downward, fingers slightly curved in a gesture that suggests he had just released something or was about to pick something up. The composition suddenly makes sense in a way it never did with the silver tray that was painted over his hands in the alteration. The original painting shows a moment of action, a narrative captured in paint, the story of this boy and this book creating a tension and significance that someone later found threatening enough to literally paint over. Sarah and Marcus work late into the evening, neither willing to stop now that the revelation is unfolding. They carefully remove the overpainting from an expanded area around the chair, revealing more of the original composition. The book is not alone in the original painting. Near it, barely visible in the shadows but unmistakably present, are what appear to be other small objects, perhaps a pencil or quill, and what might be loose papers or a folded document. The scene transforms from a static formal portrait into something much more dynamic, a moment frozen in time that carries implications and meaning that reach across a century and a half. By 9 o'clock that evening, both conservators are exhausted but exhilarated. They have successfully removed approximately 80% of the overpainting from the critical area behind the chair, and the original composition is now clearly visible. Sarah takes comprehensive photographs under various lighting conditions, documenting what they have uncovered. The images will need to be analyzed carefully, and they will need to research what the book might be, whether the gold lettering on its spine can be deciphered, and what this all means in the context of the Thornhill family and their enslaved workers. Before leaving for the night, Sarah spends a few minutes simply looking at the painting with fresh eyes. The composition now tells a completely different story. This is not merely a formal portrait of a prosperous family asserting their status and wealth. This is a painting that captures a moment of risk, of defiance, of something happening beneath the surface of the carefully constructed facade. The enslaved boy, whose name they still do not know, is not simply a prop in someone else's story. He is an active participant in a narrative that someone later found dangerous enough to erase. The fact that the alterations were made years after the original painting suggests that something happened, some event or revelation that made the family or their descendants decide that this original composition needed to be changed, that this story needed to be hidden. The next morning brings clearer weather and renewed energy. Sarah arrives to find an email waiting from Dr. Robert Harrison, a historian at Missouri State University who specializes in 19th century Ozark history and the often overlooked history of slavery in the region. She had contacted him the previous evening, sending photographs of the painting and asking if he might help provide historical context. His response expresses significant interest and indicates he will visit the conservation center that afternoon to examine the painting in person. Sarah spends the morning continuing the delicate removal of overpainting, extending the cleaned area to ensure they have revealed everything the original artist intended. As she works, she pays particular attention to the gold lettering visible on the book's spine. Under high magnification, she can make out what appear to be individual letters, though the text is painted at such a small scale that complete certainty is difficult. She thinks she can distinguish the letters that might spell out words, possibly a title, though without additional context it is hard to be certain. Marcus suggests they use digital enhancement techniques, photographing the detail at the highest possible resolution and then using computer software to sharpen and clarify the image. This proves remarkably effective, and by lunchtime they have produced an enhanced image that reveals text on the book's spine with much greater clarity. The gold lettering, though partially obscured by shadow and the natural aging of the painting, appears to spell out words that make Sarah's heart rate quicken. The text seems to read something like Webster's Spelling Book, or perhaps Elementary Spelling Book, both variations referring to what would have been known as the blue-backed speller, an educational text that was ubiquitous in 19th century American schools. This particular book, first published in 1783 and revised multiple times throughout the 19th century, was used to teach millions of American children to read and spell. However, in the context of this painting, in the hands or reach of an enslaved child, such a book carries explosive significance. Teaching enslaved people to read was not merely discouraged in slaveholding states. It was frequently illegal, punishable by law, and considered dangerous to the entire system of slavery. Dr. Harrison arrives at the conservation center shortly after 2 o'clock, a distinguished-looking African-American man in his early 60s with gray-streaked hair and an immediately warm demeanor. His expertise in regional history is evident as he examines the painting, asking detailed questions about the technical analysis and the restoration process. When Sarah shows him the revealed book and explains what the text appears to say, his reaction confirms her suspicions about the significance. He explains that Missouri had complex and often contradictory laws regarding enslaved people and education in the antebellum period. While never a Deep South cotton state, Missouri was nonetheless a slave state where the teaching of reading to enslaved people was viewed with suspicion and, in many counties, was explicitly forbidden after the 1830s, particularly following the Nat Turner Rebellion and other slave uprisings that terrified white populations throughout slaveholding regions. Dr. Harrison shares his knowledge of the Thornhill family, expanding on what Sarah had discovered in her initial research. He has encountered references to Jeremiah Thornhill in various historical documents and explains that Thornhill was known as a particularly rigid and controlling landowner, even by the standards of his time. However, Dr. Harrison also mentions something intriguing. There are brief references in county records to a controversy involving the Thornhill estate in the late 1860s, just after the Civil War ended. The references are frustratingly vague, typical of records from that tumultuous period, but they suggest some kind of legal dispute or public scandal involving the family. He promises to dig deeper into his research materials to see if he can find more specific information about what transpired. As they discuss the painting, Dr. Harrison points out additional details that take on new meaning in light of the revealed book. The mother's expression, which Sarah had noted seemed tense, now appears almost fearful. The youngest daughter's gaze, directed toward where the enslaved boy stands, seems less like the wandering attention of a bored child and more like a look of concern or perhaps even complicity. Dr. Harrison suggests that perhaps this child knew what was happening, that she had witnessed the boy with the book and was caught in the moment of that knowledge when the painting was being created. This interpretation transforms the entire composition from a simple family portrait into a complex narrative about power, knowledge, secrecy, and the many ways people were complicit in or resistant to the system of slavery. The three of them spend the rest of the afternoon examining every inch of the painting with fresh perspective. Sarah points out subtle details in the artist's technique, the way light is used to draw attention to certain elements while obscuring others, the careful composition that places the book in shadow but still visible to careful observation. Dr. Harrison notes that the very existence of this painting, with its original and censored composition, suggests that the artist must have been sympathetic to or at least willing to document this act of resistance. Portrait artists in the antebellum South were typically itinerant professionals who traveled from plantation to plantation, often spending weeks at a location to complete commissioned works. Such an artist would have had ample opportunity to observe the daily life of the household and might have deliberately chosen to capture this significant moment. As Dr. Harrison prepares to leave, he mentions that he knows a colleague at the State Historical Society of Missouri who specializes in researching enslaved people's histories using unconventional sources like estate records, wills, bills of sale, and other documents that might contain names or details usually lost to history. He offers to make contact and see if they can identify the boy in the painting, to recover his name from historical obscurity if possible. Sarah is deeply moved by this suggestion, realizing that what began as a straightforward conservation project has evolved into an opportunity to recover a lost story, to restore not just a painting but a piece of hidden history and perhaps to honor the memory of a child whose act of courage someone later tried to erase. That evening, Sarah remains at the Conservation Center long after Marcus and Dr. Harrison have left. She sits in front of the painting, now illuminated only by soft gallery lighting, and finds herself imagining the scene when this portrait was being created. She pictures the family assembled on their veranda, maintaining their practiced poses for hours while the artist worked. She imagines the enslaved boy, required to stand motionless in the background, holding his pose while knowing that just feet away, hidden behind the chair, lay something forbidden and dangerous and precious. A book, the means to literacy, the key to a kind of freedom that terrified the people who claimed to own him. She wonders how he acquired it, who might have given it to him, or whether he took it himself. She wonders if he ever got to retrieve it, or whether its discovery led to punishment. She wonders what became of him, whether he lived to see freedom, whether he ever learned to read. The following week brings an unexpected development. Dr. Harrison contacts Sarah with news that his colleague at the State Historical Society, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, has made a remarkable discovery in the archives. While searching through digitized records from Taney County, she found an estate inventory from 1871, created after Jeremiah Thornhill's death. Among the itemized property, listed with the cold precision of legal documentation, are the names of formerly enslaved people who continued working on the Thornhill farm as paid laborers after emancipation. This was not uncommon. Many formerly enslaved people had few options and remained on the same properties where they had been held in bondage, now as poorly compensated workers rather than unpaid enslaved laborers. Among these names appears one that stands out: Thomas, listed as age approximately 27 years, employed as a house worker and described in a notation as having been raised on the property. The age is significant. If Thomas was approximately 27 in 1871, he would have been around 10 or 11 years old in 1854 when the portrait was painted. This detail, combined with his description as having been raised on the property and working in the house, makes him the most likely candidate to be the boy depicted in the painting. Dr. Okonkwo's discovery includes another crucial document, a disputed will from Jeremiah Thornhill's estate. The will, dated 1870 and filed just a year before his death, contains unusual provisions that apparently caused significant family conflict. Among these provisions is a bequest of $500 and a small parcel of land to Thomas, described in the will as having been a faithful servant since childhood. The will was contested by Thornhill's adult children, who argued that their father was not of sound mind when he made these provisions, but court records indicate the will was ultimately upheld. Sarah, Marcus, Dr. Harrison, and Dr. Okonkwo gather at the Conservation Center to discuss these findings and their implications. Dr. Okonkwo, a meticulous researcher in her 40s with an encyclopedic knowledge of Missouri archives, brings copies of all the documents she has uncovered. She explains that the bequest to Thomas was extraordinarily unusual for the time and place. While it was not unheard of for slaveholders to make provisions for formerly enslaved people in their wills, such bequests typically went to individuals with whom the slaveholder had a personal connection, often their own unacknowledged children from exploitative relationships with enslaved women. The specific language used in reference to Thomas, however, does not suggest this kind of relationship but rather describes a sense of obligation or perhaps guilt. Dr. Okonkwo has also uncovered newspaper articles from the Taney County newspaper, published in 1868 and 1869, that reference a controversy involving the Thornhill family. The articles are written in the coded language typical of 19th century journalism when discussing sensitive racial matters, but they mention allegations that emerged during the immediate post-war period regarding the treatment of enslaved people on the Thornhill estate. One article from July 1868 refers obliquely to testimony given to the Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency established to assist formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction. The article mentions that claims were made regarding educational activities that had occurred on the Thornhill property before the war, though the specific nature of these activities is not detailed in the newspaper account. The group discusses possible scenarios that might connect all these disparate pieces of information. Dr. Harrison suggests that the book depicted in the painting was not simply a one-time incident but might represent an ongoing secret effort to teach Thomas to read. He proposes that perhaps someone in the Thornhill household, possibly one of the older children or even Mrs. Thornhill herself, had been providing education to Thomas, an act that would have been scandalous and potentially dangerous if discovered. This might explain Mrs. Thornhill's tense expression in the portrait and the young daughter's concerned gaze. If the artist captured a moment when this secret was at risk of discovery, it would explain why the family later felt compelled to alter the painting, to erase the evidence of what had occurred. Sarah contributes a technical observation that supports this theory. During her detailed examination of the painting, she noticed that the young daughter's hand, positioned in her lap in the visible composition, was originally painted reaching toward the chair, similar to the boy's gesture. This suggests that in the original moment captured by the artist, both the child and Thomas were oriented toward the hidden book, creating a visual connection between them that someone later found necessary to obscure. The implication is profound. This painting may document an act of resistance and compassion that crossed the brutal boundaries of slavery, a white child and an enslaved child connected by the shared secret of forbidden education. Dr. Okonkwo reveals another significant finding from her archival research. She has located records from a small subscription school that operated in Taney County in the 1850s, led by a teacher named Abigail Somerset, a New England woman who came to Missouri in 1852. Somerset's correspondence, preserved in a collection at the State Historical Society, includes letters to family members in Massachusetts in which she expresses her horror at slavery and her determination to do what she could to undermine the system. In one letter from 1853, Somerset writes about secretly teaching enslaved children to read, though she does not provide names or locations, aware that such admission could endanger both herself and those she was teaching. Somerset left Missouri abruptly in 1855, and later correspondence suggests she feared discovery and prosecution. The possibility that Abigail Somerset might have been involved in teaching Thomas adds another layer to the story. Dr. Harrison points out that some white women in the antebellum South, particularly those with Northern origins or abolitionist sympathies, did engage in covert education of enslaved people despite the legal and social risks. These activities were kept secret not only from authorities but often from the women's own families, as husbands and fathers could face social ostracism and legal consequences if such activities were discovered. If Somerset had been teaching Thomas, possibly with the knowledge or even assistance of someone in the Thornhill family, it would explain the complex dynamics suggested by the painting's original composition. Marcus raises a practical question that refocuses the group's attention. Is there any way to determine what happened to the actual book depicted in the painting, or whether Thomas indeed learned to read? Dr. Okonkwo responds that she has been searching for any documentation related to Thomas after 1871, but records from this period for African Americans in Missouri are frustratingly sparse. However, she mentions that land records might provide some clues, since the will indicated Thomas was bequeathed a small parcel of property. If he retained this land or eventually sold it, there would be a record of the transaction, and such records sometimes include details about the person's ability to sign their name versus making a mark, which could indicate literacy. The following day, Dr. Okonkwo returns with extraordinary news. She has located the land parcel that was bequeathed to Thomas in Jeremiah Thornhill's will, and she has traced its ownership history. Thomas not only kept the land but successfully farmed it and eventually purchased 2 adjacent parcels, expanding his holdings to nearly 80 acres by 1880. Property records show that he signed all documents related to these transactions with a clear, legible signature rather than making a mark, indicating he had indeed become literate. Even more remarkably, census records from 1880 list Thomas's household and indicate that he had 4 children, all of whom are listed as attending school. Dr. Okonkwo has found the ultimate confirmation that the story suggested by the painting had a triumphant, if hard-won, conclusion. Thomas did learn to read, survived slavery and the Civil War, claimed his freedom, acquired property, and ensured that his children received the education that had been denied to him. Sarah finds herself deeply moved by this revelation. The painting, which began as simply an object requiring conservation, has become a window into a story of courage, resistance, and hope that survived despite systematic efforts to erase it. She thinks about the unknown artist who chose to capture that moment, who painted that book with such loving detail, who documented Thomas's reaching hand and preserved this evidence for future generations. She thinks about whoever in the Thornhill family later ordered the painting altered, attempting to rewrite history and erase the evidence of what had occurred. And she thinks about Thomas himself, the child in the painting who risked everything to reach for that book, who somehow survived and persevered and built a life of dignity and freedom. Dr. Okonkwo shares one final discovery that brings the story full circle. She has located an obituary for Thomas, published in 1923 in a Springfield newspaper. He died at the age of approximately 79, surrounded by children and grandchildren. The obituary, written by someone who clearly knew him well, mentions that he had been born into slavery but had taught himself to read and write, becoming an educated man who was respected in his community. The obituary specifically notes that Thomas was known for his commitment to education and had donated money to establish a small library in the African American section of Taney County. The library operated until the 1950s, when desegregation led to its integration into the county's public library system. Among the books in that small library, Dr. Okonkwo has discovered through old catalog records was a well-worn copy of Webster's elementary spelling book, The Blue-Backed Speller, dated to the 1850s. The discovery leaves the entire group in awed silence. The book depicted in the painting, or one just like it, had survived. Thomas had not only learned to read but had treasured that tool of liberation enough to preserve it and eventually donate it to a library he helped establish, ensuring that other children would have access to the education he had risked so much to obtain. The painting, in its original unaltered form, had captured a moment of extraordinary significance, a turning point in one boy's life that would have reverberations across generations. The fact that someone had tried to paint over this story, to literally erase it from history, makes its recovery all the more powerful and necessary. Sarah makes a decision in that moment. The restoration of the painting will be as complete as possible, removing all of the later alterations to reveal the original composition in its entirety. But more than that, the painting's exhibition will include the full story they have uncovered, telling Thomas's story alongside the artwork. His name will be prominent, his achievements celebrated, his courage honored. The painting will no longer be simply an elegant portrait of an Ozark farm. It will be recognized as the remarkable historical document it truly is, evidence of resistance and hope and the unquenchable human desire for freedom and knowledge. The next 3 weeks are consumed by intensive restoration work. Sarah and Marcus proceed with the delicate process of removing all the overpainting that obscured the original composition, working with painstaking care to ensure that no damage occurs to the artwork beneath. As each section is cleaned and the original painting emerges, the narrative becomes increasingly clear. The book is rendered in extraordinary detail, every aspect of its appearance suggesting that the artist had observed it directly and wanted to preserve its image with perfect fidelity. The loose papers visible near the book appear to be writing sheets, and under high magnification, Sarah can detect what might be letters or words written on them, though the text is too small and obscured by shadow to be legible. As the restoration progresses, Sarah discovers additional elements that had been painted over. The young daughter's hand, restored to its original position, does appear to be reaching toward the chair, her small fingers extended in a gesture that mirrors Thomas's reaching hand. This visual echo creates a powerful connection across the racial and social divides that separated them, suggesting shared knowledge and possibly shared risk. Even more poignantly, Sarah discovers that the artist had originally painted a slight smile on the girl's face, subtle but unmistakable, an expression of what might be interpreted as conspiratorial joy or satisfaction. This smile was painted over in the alterations, replaced with the neutral expression that appears in the modified version. Dr. Harrison and Dr. Okonkwo continue their research, driven by the momentum of their discoveries. They have begun searching for any surviving descendants of Thomas who might be interested in this remarkable story about their ancestor. Through a combination of genealogical research and outreach to local historical societies, Dr. Okonkwo locates a woman named Denise Thomas Watson, a great-great-granddaughter of Thomas who lives in Kansas City. When contacted about the painting and the research findings, Denise expresses overwhelming emotion and immediate desire to be involved in the project. She shares that family stories had always mentioned that her ancestor had been enslaved as a child but had somehow learned to read and become an educated man, though the specific details had been lost over generations. Denise visits the conservation center, and the moment when she first sees the restored painting is profoundly moving for everyone present. Sarah watches as Denise approaches the artwork, her hand covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she looks at the image of her ancestor as a young boy, frozen in that moment of reaching toward forbidden knowledge. Denise brings with her a family Bible that Thomas had owned, and inside the front cover is an inscription in careful, practiced handwriting. This book belongs to Thomas, who learned to read so that he might read the Word of God and teach his children to do the same. The handwriting matches the signature on the land documents that Dr. Okonkwo had discovered, confirming once again Thomas's achievement of literacy. Denise shares family stories that add personal dimension to the historical record. She tells them that according to family tradition, Thomas had always credited a white woman and a white child with helping him learn to read, though their names had been lost to time. The family story described how Thomas had hidden his learning, practicing his reading in secret for years before emancipation finally allowed him to admit his literacy openly. Denise mentions that her grandmother, Thomas's granddaughter, had told stories about Thomas insisting that all his descendants pursue education, treating it as a sacred obligation and the most important legacy he could pass down. His commitment to education had indeed reverberated through generations. Denise herself is a schoolteacher, as were her mother and grandmother before her. The museum in Branson that owns the painting learns of the discoveries and immediately recognizes the significance of what has been uncovered. The museum director, Elizabeth Carr, visits the conservation center and engages in lengthy discussions with Sarah, the historians, and Denise about how to present this painting in a way that honors its complex history and Thomas's story. Elizabeth proposes a major exhibition that will feature the restored painting as the centerpiece but will also include extensive contextual materials about slavery in the Ozarks, the laws against teaching enslaved people to read, the stories of resistance and education, and Thomas's life story as far as it can be documented. Denise is invited to participate in the exhibition planning, ensuring that her ancestor's story is told with dignity and accuracy. Sarah completes the restoration in early December, just over 2 months after the painting first arrived at the Conservation Center. The revealed original composition is striking in its narrative clarity and the artist's skill. Thomas stands not in shadow but in a shaft of light that the artist carefully painted to illuminate his face and reaching hand. The book behind the chair is rendered with such precision that the title on its spine is legible even without magnification. The visual connection between Thomas and the young daughter creates an undeniable suggestion of alliance and shared secret. The father's stern expression and possessive grip on the chair take on new meaning, appearing less like confidence and more like vigilant control, the posture of a man who senses that something is slipping beyond his authority. Through careful analysis of the painting's materials and technique, Sarah and Marcus are finally able to identify the artist. Comparison with signed works in other collections reveals that the painting was almost certainly created by William C. Patterson, an itinerant portrait artist who worked throughout Missouri, Arkansas, and Kansas in the 1840s and 50s. Research into Patterson's biography reveals that he was originally from Pennsylvania, a free state, and that he had briefly been involved with anti-slavery organizations before moving to the border states to pursue his art career. His decision to document Thomas's reaching for the book, to illuminate rather than shadow that gesture, to create visual connections that suggested forbidden alliance, suddenly appears not as artistic accident but as deliberate choice. A quiet act of witness and perhaps protest by an artist who could not openly oppose slavery but could subtly document acts of resistance against it. The exhibition opens in late February at the museum in Branson, drawing substantial media attention and crowds larger than the museum has seen in years. The restored painting hangs in the main gallery, lit with careful attention to bring out the details that Sarah and Marcus worked so hard to reveal. Beside it, a series of panels tells Thomas's story, from his childhood in slavery through his achievement of literacy, his survival of the Civil War and emancipation, his acquisition of property, his commitment to his children's education, and his establishment of the library that ensured other children would have access to books. The exhibition includes the actual Webster's Speller from that library, loaned for the exhibition, displayed in a climate-controlled case where visitors can see the physical object that connects to the book in the painting. Denise speaks at the exhibition opening, her voice strong and clear as she addresses a packed gallery. She talks about her ancestor's courage, about the risks he took to reach for that book, about the determination that carried him from slavery to freedom to prosperity and education. She talks about the importance of remembering these stories, of understanding that resistance to slavery took many forms, that education was itself a revolutionary act, that the preservation of evidence like this painting allows present generations to honor past courage. She thanks Sarah and the conservation team for their meticulous work, thanks Dr. Harrison and Dr. Okonkwo for their research, and thanks the museum for committing to tell this story fully and honestly. Sarah watches from the side of the gallery, feeling a sense of completion and purpose that transcends any previous restoration project she has undertaken. She has spent her career preserving artworks, revealing the original intentions of artists, and making historical objects accessible to contemporary audiences. But this project has been different, more personal, and more consequential. By revealing what was hidden, by refusing to accept the altered version as the true story, she has participated in recovering a piece of history that someone had deliberately tried to erase. The painting is now not just a restored artwork but a reclaimed story, a testimony to resistance and hope that speaks across 170 years. In the weeks following the exhibition opening, Sarah receives correspondence from historians, educators, and descendants of other enslaved people expressing gratitude for the work done on this painting and asking whether similar examinations might be conducted on other historical artworks. The project has revealed that paintings from the slavery era may contain hidden layers, both literally and figuratively, that careful restoration and research can uncover. Sarah begins planning a broader initiative to examine other artworks from this period, to look beneath the surface of accepted historical narratives and seek evidence of the lives and resistance of enslaved people that may have been deliberately obscured. Dr. Harrison publishes an academic paper about the painting and Thomas's story, contributing to the growing scholarship on slavery in the Ozarks and challenging the regional narrative that often minimizes or overlooks this history. Dr. Okonkwo continues her archival research, discovering additional records related to Thomas and his family, including school records for his children that document their academic achievements and letters that Thomas wrote to local newspapers in the 1880s and 90s advocating for educational opportunities for African American children. Each new discovery adds dimension to the portrait of a man who transformed the moment captured in that painting into a lifetime commitment to education and advancement. The young daughter in the painting, whom Dr. Okonkwo has identified as Mary Catherine Thornhill, lived until 1938. Late in life, she gave an interview to a local newspaper in which she spoke about growing up on the Ozark farm before the Civil War. The interview, discovered in archived newspaper collections, includes a remarkable passage where Mary Catherine mentions that she had been taught, as a very young child, that slavery was wrong by someone she describes as a kind teacher. She states that she never forgot that lesson and that it influenced her to support education for African American children in the years after the war. While she does not specifically mention Thomas or the book or the portrait, the timing and details strongly suggest she is referencing the events that the painting captures. Her testimony provides a final piece of confirmation that the story revealed by the restored painting is not speculation but documented truth. On a spring afternoon 4 months after the exhibition opened, Sarah returns to the museum to see the painting once more. She stands in front of it, alone in the gallery during a quiet weekday period, and studies Thomas's face. She thinks about the boy he was, the risks he took, the determination that drove him to reach for that book despite knowing the potential consequences. She thinks about the artist who chose to document that moment, who used his skill to preserve evidence of something that was supposed to remain invisible. She thinks about the person who years later tried to paint over that evidence, who believed they could erase this story from history. And she thinks about how truth, like the original paint beneath those later alterations, has a way of persisting, waiting to be revealed by those willing to look carefully and refuse to accept that what appears on the surface is all there is to see. The painting now hangs with a new label that includes Thomas's full name, his dates of birth and death as far as they can be determined, and a brief statement of his achievement. It no longer presents an anonymous enslaved boy as a mere prop in someone else's portrait but honors him as the subject of his own story, a story of courage and determination that resonates powerfully with contemporary audiences. School groups visit the exhibition regularly, and educators use the painting to teach about slavery, resistance, the importance of education, and the ways historical narratives can be manipulated or obscured. Thomas's reaching hand, revealed after a century and a half of concealment, now extends across time, connecting past and present, reminding viewers that the quest for knowledge and freedom is timeless and that acts of courage, even though someone tries to erase, have a way of surviving and inspiring future generations. As Sarah leaves the museum that afternoon, walking out into the spring sunshine, she carries with her a renewed sense of purpose. Art conservation is not merely technical work, not simply about preserving old objects. It is about revealing truth, about refusing to let important stories remain hidden, about honoring the courage of those who came before and ensuring their actions are remembered. The elegant portrait of the Ozark farm has been transformed by restoration, not in its physical appearance alone but in its meaning and significance. What was hidden has been revealed, what was erased has been restored, and Thomas's story, the story of a boy who reached for a book and changed his own destiny, will now be told and retold, inspiring others to reach for their own dreams of knowledge and freedom. The painting hangs in the museum as testimony that truth endures, that resistance matters, that education is power, and that even the most determined efforts to erase history can be overcome by those willing to look beneath the surface and recover what was meant to remain hidden forever. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.